Okay, so we're going to be kind of bridging the gap from Mark 14 into Mark 15. And last week, do y'all remember where we left Peter while all this stuff was going on? Yeah, he's still in the courtyard. It's really that's an image that you think about what Jesus is going through. And where we left off there, we're down in Mark 14, verse 66 through 72. And in verse 66 and 67, it says, as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Nazarene." So all this time, all this thing, this trial that's done in the hidden in darkness, done not as what was accustomed to, completely going against what was required, all this that Jesus is going through, and we leave Peter still warming himself by the fire. And I wonder, and it's just a wonder, but I wonder as Peter reflected how he, what Jesus said to him about denying him. I wonder if these things are things that he would have thought about in his mind, what he was doing, how he was tending to his own needs when Jesus was betrayed into the hands. And ultimately, he already knew, because Jesus had told him exactly what he was going to be going through. Peter warming himself by the fire. So is there any question? So going back into that verse 66 and 67, it says, and seeing Peter, this is a servant girl, seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Nazarene." So is she asking if he was with Jesus? No, she knows. It's not a question. She knows. I mean, there's a lot of things you could think about of how she would know. Simply, they've not been hiding from people. They've been coming in, they've been teaching in the synagogues, they've been around Jesus. So she's pretty confident she knows exactly who he is. Is that the right page? No, that's why that didn't make any sense. It's the wrong page. It's like, that doesn't make any sense at all. All right. Yeah, so there's no question of who this girl knows Peter to be, but it certainly appears that she had firsthand knowledge and had observed that Peter was with Jesus, with in the sense of someone who was one of his companions. So yeah, maybe that's in the temple. I don't know, but she definitely seems very confident. So in verse 68, look at Peter's response, and here's where we get into exactly what Jesus said he's going to do. But he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you are talking about." And he went out onto the porch, and a rooster crowed. What did Peter think? So it says, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't even understand. I don't even understand. Completely denies and rejects any acknowledgement of who Jesus is. And he says he went out of the porch, and immediately a rooster crowed. What did Peter think? Did he even hear it? Did he even hear the rooster? I don't know. I mean, is it just something, Jerry?
Well, in somewhere, I can't remember exactly where it says he wept bitterly.
Well, we're getting there. Yeah, that's a little bit further down. We're getting there. Richard, you had a comment? Yes, I'm sorry, verse 68, but he denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you are talking about. And he went out onto the porch, and a rooster crowed. Yeah, sorry. Really? Huh. Oh, interesting. So I do have a footnote. That does say that it's a later manuscript that added, and a rooster crowed. So, Yeah, that's right. Well, what did Jesus tell him was going to happen? He's going to deny him, right? 3 times, right? Going to deny him 3 times. But, I might look a little bit further into that. Maybe I can see what actually caused that addition of that statement from the later manuscript, and when that actually occurred. Sometimes you can find that out. So we'll take a look. All right, so here's a thought. So as we consider Peter, we can be really, really harsh on Peter. We can say, how could you possibly know? Jesus tells you, you know who Jesus is. You're the one who actually made the proclamation that you are the Son of God. So how can you be told by Jesus that this is what's going to happen? When this all really starts to happen, you're going to deny that you even know who I am. And you're going to do that before the rooster crowed. And we can be very, very harsh on Peter looking at, of course, it's a fulfillment of prophecy. But you think about Jesus and him knowing our own hearts. How about us? How about us? So do we get guidance from God and instruction, even ways to recognize when we are going down a bad path? And then when we choose to still go down that path, do we recognize when we are being corrected? Or do we harden our hearts? Just a thought. Can we be like Peter? We get a lot of instruction out of God's Word, don't we? That tells us how to live. Have you ever been in a position where you're in the workplace or you're out about the world and something starts to occur and you know exactly what you've been instructed to do, what you should do, and then maybe you don't quite do that? So we can be pretty hard on Peter, but I do think there's a lesson for ourselves in how we choose to live our lives. And effectively, we're going to get into this a little bit later as we get into chapter 15. I mean, are there ways today that we deny Christ? Right? We'll just leave that question out there as we move through. All right, verse 69. So the servant girl saw him and began once more to say to the bystanders, "This is one of them." So in Luke, it actually states another servant girl. So, again, not guessing. This is someone who knows that Peter was one of Jesus' companions, one of his followers. So how many witnesses does it actually take to confirm a fact? Two. And she actually alerts the bystanders. Hey, this person is one of them. This is one person that was one of Jesus' followers. Considering the time this is occurring, all those present are either part of this kind of kangaroo court or those with an interest in seeing what is to occur. So most of these folks that are surrounding in the middle of this night are there, part of this effort to deliver Jesus over, or maybe they're, it's in the middle of the night. So you would think that the majority of the folks there have a vested interest in seeing Jesus, and maybe those that are with him be brought to account, their account. So that may be including in that crowd who she's speaking with some of the very same people that were part of the crowd that arrested Jesus. You don't know, just speculation, but given that that's what has occurred, right? You had a crowd, they arrested Jesus in the garden, they have brought him to the chief priest's house, they're having all of this trial. You would assume that it's all part of that group. Lynn, do you have a thought? Servant girl of the high priest. So, and I thought a little bit about the servant girls, like would they have been part of the crowd? Probably not. I mean, they were servants to, they would probably just, but they certainly, if they're servants to the high priest, you would certainly think they would have been there in the temple where they would have seen Jesus teaching, where they would have seen the disciples with Jesus. They would have been witness to some of those things. Eric? Yeah, right, because when we get into 15, it's early morning when they're going to deliver him over to Pilate, right? So yeah, we're talking the middle, the darkness of night, middle of night. So, all right, so she alerts the bystanders. Then going into verse 70, 71, 72, let's just read those three verses. But again he denied it, and after a little while the bystanders were again saying to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean too." But he began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man you are talking about." Immediately a rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had made the remark to him, "Before a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times," and he began to weep. And that's, Jerry, your point that you brought up. So it says in verse 70, another hour had passed. We're still talking about in the middle, what we would consider in the middle of the night. You are a Galilean too. So those from Galilee had a distinct accent in how they spoke, so something that they could recognize just in how Peter actually talked. And then it says in verse 71 that Peter cursed and swore. So not like we think of today. So when you think of curse and swear, what do you think of?
I don't know.
Well, all right. Well, you think of bad language. That's really not what it means here. This means like swearing upon himself. So when he says curse, literally means to put himself under a curse, right? So as an example, and we won't turn there, but you can look at 1 Samuel 3:17 or 2 Samuel 3:35, some of that language that would say, "May God do also to me if I don't do this," right? So if I know who Jesus is, then may God strike me down. Like that's what it's referring to, is to place himself under a curse and to swear, like someone would say, "I swear I don't know who he is. I have never met the guy." So curse and swear has a connotation today of just the use of bad language. That's not what this means here. But to put himself under a curse and to take an oath, to promise that I do not know who this guy is. In verse 72, it then says, immediately a rooster crowed a second time. Peter remembered how Jesus had made a remark to him, "Before a rooster crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times," and he began to weep. So when did the rooster crow? Immediately, right? Glenn, you have a thought? Yeah.
Every time I imagine after this that a rooster crowed, Peter's mind would go back.
Yeah. Yeah, so Glenn's point is in...
I think that we were talking earlier about God helping us to see the right way. I imagine this was a constant reminder for him. And we probably have things in our own life, things that remind us of God's will and our failures.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. And just before I forget, Linda invited us all over to hear how a rooster said. Someone said, "Come to my house," right? We can all go over if we want to listen to what it sounds like for a rooster to crow. Cross over the hill, and you can hear it from a long way off. But Glenn's point is that it's not something that we might be accustomed to, but certainly in an agrarian society, like that's something that would be a regular occurrence. So imagine Peter, for the remainder of his life, anytime he would hear a rooster crow, where do you think his mind would go? That would serve as a reminder. And as Glenn said, when we fail in our lives and somehow God has corrected us or shown us our failure, do we have those things in our lives that from time to time they occur and we recall where we used to be, how we used to live, and how God corrected us and how we choose to continue to live, as a reminder. Did I get that about right? Okay. Yeah, great point. So yeah, that rooster crows immediately. So you imagine speaking those words and just immediately hearing the crow from the rooster. And then it had to have occurred very quickly after, and then it says, as Jerry, you pointed out earlier, right? So he weeps and he leaves. The other account says, in Luke, talks about him, he wept and then he left. So he departs. Again, all of this occurring throughout the dark of the night. Let's go ahead and move on into Mark chapter 15. All right, so Mark chapter 15, we're going to start through verses 1 through 21 today. And as I pointed out, the study, and I have not been using the study with the exception of perusing it. It's one that Brent handed to us from Sunset School of Preaching. But there's some things in there, and it just does some things to kind of consider maybe topically what certain sections of the verses are covering. And so Mark 15, 1 through 21, kind of what it posed was release him or crucify him. So it's an interesting thing, right? There's like no middle ground. It's like free him or kill him. Nothing in between. And so as we go into Mark 15, starting in verse 1 through 5, we'll read those and we'll just then go verse by verse. Early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and scribes and the whole council immediately held a consultation. And binding Jesus, they led him away and they delivered him to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, It is as you say." The chief priests began to accuse him harshly. Then Pilate questioned him again, saying, "Do you not answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so Pilate was amazed. So Mark has, and we won't for the sake of time, we basically have this week and a couple more. There is so much more detail if you go across all of the gospel accounts and then even back into Isaiah and some of the old prophets. There's so much more detail that can be added on. So we're gonna stick pretty close to Mark here, but we are going to jump around a little bit to add some context that's not there in Mark's account. So again, release him or crucify him. So verse 1, who do they take Jesus to? Yeah. They take him, the priests take him they deliver him over to Pilate, right? And they bind him, which is interesting, because at this point, I mean, he's never resisted. But they bind him and they deliver him to Pilate. And any ideas, I mean, you think about where this is headed and the case they're going to try to make to Pilate? Any idea why they might bind him if he hasn't shown any resistance?
Makes him look guilty.
Right, yeah. Dangerous, right? Because what's one of the cases they're going to make about him? That he's a what? Yeah, rebel, an insurrectionist, which is really hypocritical considering who they want released, right? Which is exactly who they are, right? It's hypocrites. Jesus has been saying that all along. So yeah, they're going to take him bound to Pilate, and it says in Luke 23:1, don't have to turn there, but it says the whole body of them went with him. So you're talking, this is the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, and the whole council. And the great Sanhedrin was comprised of roughly 71 people. So this is quite a large group to bring Jesus bound and deliver him to Pilate. So Pilate, of course, is a Roman, governor of the region. The Jews themselves were not permitted to carry out a death sentence. Only Rome could do that, which is really interesting when you get to into Acts, which is a whole different study. But there's a number of reasons the Jews wanted to put Jesus to death. He challenged their authority in front of the people. They believed he broke the Sabbath laws of observance. He mixed with people that the Jewish leaders regarded as sinful and unclean. He made claims about himself that the Jewish leaders could not accept or would not accept. But was any of it something that per Roman law would have been worthy of death? No. No. What's that?
You got to talk about
tearing down the temple and rebuilding it.
Right, that's what it means by making claims about himself that they couldn't accept or didn't understand. Eric said he also made the claim he'd tear down the temple, rebuild it in 3 days, referring to his body, but they didn't understand that. So this is really no different than them trying to find, if you remember the beginning of the trial, which were just hours before here, they were trying to find witnesses and testimony that would be worthy of death. But they found none, aside from when they asked Jesus himself, and he makes it very clear that he is the Son of God. They decide then, that's blasphemy, and they're going to make that case as custom to their customs, is deserving of death. The problem with the case of blasphemy is what? The Romans don't care about that. Right. It's not punishable by death. Romans wouldn't care. They don't worship that God. But the real problem with blasphemy is that Jesus is who he says he is. Jesus is the Son of God. So there is no blasphemy. So it's a false accusation. Yeah, they tried to put forth a couple of witnesses to make accusations against him. It's Mark's account actually talks about how they couldn't even get that testimony right. When he testified about tearing down the temple, rebuilding it, they say they were inconsistent in even that. They were inconsistent. To Richard's point, nothing per Roman law, like even the claim of blasphemy, none of that per Roman law would have been worthy of death. And we're going to see that Pilate's he's going to conclude that. Right? There's not anything. This isn't something where Pilate became convinced and exacted a judgment of guilt. We're going to see that he's going to, quite literally and figuratively, wash his hands of it. And so in verse 2, it says, Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "It is as you say." Are you king? It is, he said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" So it is as you say. Now, Jesus' response is interesting because is Jesus merely the king of the Jewish nation? Yeah, he's a king of all, isn't he? No, he's over all nations. And let me take a look here. John chapter 18. And so starting at verse 33, therefore Pilate entered into the praetorium, and he summoned Jesus, and he said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" So that's an interesting response from Jesus, right? It's not something that Pilate would have come to of his own accord. It's likely an accusation that's been made. Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priest delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." So, what type of kingdom is Jesus over? Yeah, so he's making the case. Could you see how, and we're going to get to this down below a little bit first, but you think about the chief priests bringing these accusations before Pilate, what would they try to make Jesus look like? Like he's questioning whose authority? Yeah, earthly, the Roman authority, the Roman establishment authority over the Jewish people. And it says in verse 3, going back to Mark 15, verse 3, the chief priests began to accuse him harshly. And literally, if you have a little footnote over there, harshly, of many things. So what were some of the basis of the accusations? And I think, a good place to turn there, you could look at all of them, but for the sake of time, we'll just look at one. Let's go ahead and move to Luke chapter 23. And reading in verses 2 through 7, and they began to accuse him. So this is again the chief priest, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ a king." So Pilate asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered and said, "It is as you say." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they kept on insulting, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee even as far as this place." When Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. So here's all these accusations. So you think in Mark, he just says, accuse them harshly, and which literally means of many things. So some of those things are, he is misleading the people, which I don't know if the Romans would have cared much of that. But then they say he says he forbids to pay taxes. He doesn't pay taxes, which is simply, is that true or not? Yeah, it's completely untrue. And then he says he claims himself as a king. So he's putting forth this perspective to Pilate of a claim that Jesus had made, but in a spiritual sense, as though he is one who is challenging the authority of Roman rule and of Caesar. And in verse 5, it says he stirs up the people. So Luke incites rebellion, leading to insurrection, which is extremely interesting considering, again, who they will then demand to be released. So you see the hypocrisy, you see the lengths to which they will go. And in verse 7, it then says, that's still in Luke, verse 7 in Luke, it says he sends him to Herod, Galilean. Herod happens to be in town, and it's within his jurisdiction. So what's Pilate trying to do? Does it sound like Pilate's pretty convinced that Jesus is guilty? No. So he's trying to, he's walking a really thin line. So there's two times that you could think that Pilate kind of washes his hands. Once is figuratively. Oh, it's Galilean. Hey, I'm going to send him to Herod. I'm done with that. Of course, he's going to come back. He's going to be sent back. And then very literally but symbolically, Matthew 27, where Pilate is going to wash his hands after determining that there is no guilt. So John 19:4, I find no guilt in him. So consider the people that have brought Jesus before all of this. Consider it from a Mosaic law perspective. So how many witnesses were they required to have to condemn a man? Yeah. What was the penalty for bearing false witness? Yeah. What was the penalty for murder? Yeah. Do the people that are delivering Jesus have any concern for who God is? No. They are completely focused on their own worldly desires. Let's turn to John chapter 19. Plan was already in motion. So Pilate and Herod became friends that very day and had previously been enemies. John 19, verse 10 and 11. This is one that it's not recorded in Mark's account. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Pilate's authority. Does he have authority to release Jesus? Yes. He does. So consider that. It's not that long ago, we were talking about Jesus in the garden, praying to his Father. What did Jesus ask his Father?
Not my will, but thine be done.
Well, that's what he concluded, but what did he ask?
Because it has passed from me.
Yeah. Father, I acknowledge you can do all things. So if there's another way, can this cup pass from me and still accomplish your purpose? And but not your will, not my will, but your will be done. And ultimately, what was God's answer to Jesus?
You're going to die.
He sent an angel to strengthen him, didn't he? So how interesting is that? Consider Jesus from the point, think about it from a worldly perspective. The point he received God's answer in the garden was strengthened by an angel. Everybody he came into contact with, that from our worldly perspective, he could have petitioned to spare his life. What would we have done if we were falsely accused? What do people do today? Even when they're not falsely accused, even when they're actually guilty. They try to defend themselves, don't they? He could have petitioned so many to spare his life that we would think would have been in a position to grant it. The mob that arrested him, the chief priests, the scribes, the council, the Roman guards, Herod, Pilate. Why didn't Jesus beg for his life? He didn't do anything worthy of death. That wasn't the plan. And he knew what his Father's will was. He got his answer. He knew his Father's will, what he was sent to do. He received his answer in the garden when he asked if there was another way. There was not. And then he faithfully discharged the will of his Father. What a great example that is for us. Do we sometimes get an answer from God in his word on what we should do?
Is that Judas? And,
Yeah, the one who delivered him over. I believe, yes, I believe that's correct. He's referring to Judas, the greater sin, the one who delivered over. So are we sometimes reluctant, or do we even sometimes refuse to accept God's will? And again, you consider mankind, even when man does wrong and is deserving of punishment, and maybe even deserving of death, every case is made to spare and reduce punishment. Right? You fast forward all of this in today's modern age, and from the time that Jesus was accused to the time that he would have been put on the cross would have probably been something like 10 or 15 years before it actually would have happened in the modern day society, right? There would have been appeals, there would have been all sorts of things making that case. But what an example of our Savior, who knew the answer of his Father and then resolutely moves forward and does his Father's will. And he tells Pilate, the only authority you have is that which was given to me by the Father. And I've already got my answer from him. He's already told me what's expected. Any comments or questions as we move on? Okay. So back to Mark 15. We'll read verses 6 through 15. Now at the feast, he used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested. The man named Barabbas had been imprisoned with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the insurrection. The crowd went up and began asking him to do as he had been accustomed to for them. Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he was aware that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. Answering again, Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with him whom you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." But Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." Wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, And after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. So Barabbas, in verses 6 and 7, what is he? Yeah, I mean, he quite literally is an insurrectionist. What they're accusing Jesus of. And in the insurrection was party to committing murder. So most likely Mark's and Luke's accounts referring to insurrection would be participation in one or more of the numerous riots or insurrections of Jewish zealots against Roman rule and power. That's what's thought of. So you can kind of understand why the Jewish people wouldn't necessarily see Barabbas as a murderer. They might see him kind of as one who's fighting the Roman occupation over God's people. So, Glenn?
Interesting that his name, Barabbas, means son of the Father. Abba, Father.
Yeah.
Bar is son. And he's not.
He's not, yeah. So,
He's not. This is his name. It's interesting that he stands in contrast.
yeah.
Jesus and that the people choose.
That's interesting. So his name, and you might have to help me, Glenn, but Barabbas means son of the Father. So you've got truly the Son of Man, the Son of God, who truly is, and you have one whose name means the Son of the Father, who is not, and they choose him over who is truly the Son of God. So Barabbas may not have been considered a villain by the Jewish people who universally disliked being under Roman rule. The hypocrisy comes in that they are trying to make the case to Pilate that Jesus is an insurrectionist. So do we have any account of Jesus ever espousing in his teachings that the Jewish people need to rise up against Roman rule? None, right? None. Matthew 22, 15 through 22, don't need to turn there, but that's the account of when he's questioned about paying taxes to Caesar. Certainly would have been a good opportunity for Jesus to teach insurrection, right? But he says to do what? Render. Yeah. And it's much easier to render to Caesar what is Caesar's than for those people to have done what God's will was. So verse 9 and 10, Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release the king of the Jews? For he was aware that the chief priests handed him over because of envy." So this is where we know with certainty that Pilate never has come to the conclusion that there's guilt in Jesus. He even understands that the motive behind this is not truly that Jesus has done something worthy of death, but the motive is envy. And it's interesting because you do get a sense for the disdain that the Romans, or maybe the superiority the Romans felt over the Jewish people by how he's addressing the crowd, right? Would you have me release the king of the Jews? You almost can, hear the mocking. But the disdain for the crowd and what they're doing, he effectively, again, mocks them. Verses 11 through 15. It says, "But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. Answering again, Pilate said to them, 'Then what shall I do with him whom you call King of the Jews?' They shouted back, 'Crucify him.' But Pilate said to them, 'Why, what evil has he done?' They shouted all the more, 'Crucify him.' Wishing to satisfy the crowd, he released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified." So now who's leading sort of a mini insurrection? Right? It says the chief priests, it says they stirred up the crowd. So the custom was ahead of during Passover to release a prisoner, but the truth is that a prisoner that is not guilty of anything should be released anyway. And it should not require any petition of the people per tradition of the Romans. Pilate knows there is no guilt, nothing worthy of death, but the chief priests stirred up the crowd to demand Jesus to be crucified. And ultimately, Pilate, who's a governor of a province and is charged with keeping order, he releases Barabbas and delivers Jesus to be crucified. Verse 15 tells us what Pilate's motivation was. What was his motivation? Yeah, satisfy the crowd. Eric?
I don't understand that Pilate keep referring to Jesus as King of the Jews, even though he knew the chief priest was not like that.
Right, that's what I was pointing out. He keeps calling him the King of the Jews. So you can really kind of tell how the Romans saw themselves in comparison to the Jewish people. It's kind of like poking the bear, I guess, you know.
To me.